my dears, today I want to talk about something that I've been noticing for a while now on social media, and that is the number of people that are declaring that they feel politically homeless. I did a poll a while ago asking if you felt politically homeless in your home country, and it was really interesting reading your comments because it made me realize just how much of a global issue this actually is. Yes, I'm from Germany, and none of the current parties represent my views. They're either too left, too authoritarian, too right, or too bought out by lobbyists seemingly. I'm Mexican, and I remember when I was little, I was so excited that one day I would be able to vote. That day came and all the options were shit. I see it happening all over the world. Really, the average citizen does more good and change than politicians. I've been politically homeless since the 2020 election. I used to be left, but decided to stay moderate. I'm in the US and things have gotten so polarizing and toxic. Nobody seems to think for themselves anymore. It doesn't help that nobody wants to talk about politics because it's seen as a touchy subject over here. As a young 19-year-old guy from the UK, I lean differently depending on the issue. I believe that both sides have something to offer. However, I'm sick and tired of people fighting each other over having different political views. Now's not the time to be divided. It says a lot about the way things are going when people in power care little about us while people who vote are too busy fighting instead of looking to find common ground. And as I was reading through many of your comments, these seem to be the most popular sentiments that I saw. Many people said that they felt very disconnected to their current political parties and felt as though they didn't represent them, or they were just quite tired of the polarizing, toxic discussions that are happening often online or in the real world when it comes to the topic of politics. According to Unheard, 6 in 10 Brits report feeling politically homeless. Of the people they surveyed, they found that most of the voters agreed with the statement, "Frankly, there is no political party I actually like," with 58% of people under 25 agreeing with this statement, 53% of people over 50 also agreeing with this statement. They also found that women were more likely to feel dissatisfied with the current political climate, with 61% of them agreeing with the statement compared to 55% of men. Things don't really seem to be all that much better in the US, with many Americans saying that they don't currently feel very represented under the current political climate. But what's really interesting to me is just how diverse this group is. They didn't all take the same route to political homelessness. And so within this video, I'm going to be discussing with you all of my theories based on what I've observed on why I think there's a growing number of people who feel politically homeless. Many people right now feel a lot of political disenchantment. They know what their views are and what their values are, but they just don't think that any of the political parties currently on offer really represent those values. And this appears to be an issue on both sides of the political spectrum. In the UK, we have Labour supporters who don't really feel like Labour represents them anymore, and also Tory voters who feel that the Conservatives are conservative in name only. In the US, we have Republican voters who can't bring themselves to vote for Trump, and Democrat voters who can't bring themselves to vote for Biden. And so this lack of satisfaction when it comes to political candidates or political parties is causing a lot of people to just feel stuck. And many of them are starting to become very apathetic because they feel quite hopeless, because if your options are choosing between being stabbed or being shot, it's hardly a choice. I saw a video that I thought perfectly summed up modern political parties.
All men and women created by you know the thing.
Is it any wonder that neither Joe Biden nor Donald Trump can crack 50% in approval ratings? They're cringe-inducing to everyone except hardcore partisans.
Why the hell would I take a test? Are you a junkie?
No religion, no anything. Hurt the Bible, hurt God.
Which is why just 31% of Americans identify as Democrats and only 26% as Republicans. 41% say they're politically independent. The major parties are selling Americans on policy bundles that are utterly inane. If you want tax cuts, you have to vote against abortion, in favor of billions more in military spending, and against immigration. If you want to vote in favor of immigration, you have to also sign on to a $2 trillion Green New Deal, trapping children in failing school districts and massive tax hikes.
And this policy bundle way of doing politics is also an issue that I've seen people raise in the UK. This reality that if there is one particular issue you care about, you have to also vote in other policies that you don't really like or agree with. Although in the UK, I would say the biggest issue that people have is that there isn't a massive difference between the two parties. Whether you vote for Tory or vote for Labour, you're still going to get tax rises. Whether you vote for Tory or vote for Labour, you're still going to get net zero. Whether you vote for Labour or vote for Tory, you're probably still going to get high immigration. For many people, voting has become a lot less about who you want to get in and more so about who you want to keep out. As many people now feel as though when they're voting, they're just simply picking their poison, as opposed to picking the candidate that they're really excited or enthusiastic about. Tribalism is also another common complaint I hear from the politically homeless. They are really tired of this toxic us versus them rhetoric that they're so used to seeing now on social media, as well as in mainstream media, especially because a lot of mainstream media outlets do have their biases and so do often only show one side of a story, which brings us to today's sponsor, Ground News. I really enjoyed exploring Ground News and seeing how it works. It's basically an app/website that offers more transparency in the news that we see. With access to over 50,000 news sources across the political spectrum, they offer more information such as where the sources politically lean, who owns them, and how reliable the information is. Most importantly, they let you compare headlines to show you side-by-side differences in these reportings. Recently, Elon Musk was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, and on Ground News, I can see that 33 sources reported on the story, and the article coverage analysis tells me that 63% of the reports lean right, 25% lean center, and 13% lean left. I can also see that 22% of the sources are independent news outlets, and we can also see the factuality rating of the sources and see which sources have the most reliable reporting track record. What's also really interesting is just how differently these news outlets reported on this story. This left-leaning headline reads, "Musk and Assange follow Putin, Trump, and Stalin as Nobel Peace Prize nominees," compared to this right-leaning outlet that said, "Elon Musk nominated for Nobel Peace Prize 2024 for considering him a defender of freedom of expression." Showing a different framing between the two sides, it seems the left are lumping Musk in with some people who are considered unsavory characters, and the right seems to be more hyper-focused on the fact that he was nominated for defending free speech. Ground News also has this really useful blind spot feature where you can see which stories are receiving less coverage on each side, such as how no one on the left is talking about the parents who are launching a court battle after the state removed their child from their custody over improper pronoun use, or how no one on the right is reporting on this report that claims that switching to electric vehicles could prevent millions of illnesses in US children by 2050. Ground News is a great tool for looking at your news more critically by giving you more transparency and more information about the sources, so that way you can compare all the different sources and compare all the different news information you're getting from these sources and make up your own mind about how you feel about these issues now that you have access to all the different perspectives. You can sign up to Ground News today by clicking on the link in my description, and you can receive 30% off the Vantage plan, which works out to be around $6 a month or £5 a month, and you'll be able to access all of these features. Thank you, Ground News, for supporting the channel. The rhetoric on the two main sides of the political spectrum have definitely become more toxic with the introduction of social media, especially because the way these algorithms typically work is by perpetuating the most extreme ideas and the most confrontational ideas, because those typically tend to generate the most engagement. When you're a normie who has more reasonable, regular, everyday people views, you're not as controversial, and so you don't really incite as much anger. Although that could very well be changing, because I am seeing more and more people who share very reasonable, normal takes getting a lot of crap from both sides. Which brings us to our next point, the alienated moderate. I personally wouldn't be surprised if the vast majority of people who consider themselves to be politically homeless fall within the moderate category. So may they be center-left, center-right, centrist, moderate, whatever. The people who fall within that part of the political spectrum, I think they probably make up the vast majority of people who feel politically homeless today. I feel like I should also probably define what a centrist is, because to be honest, I also had never heard of this term before until I started seeing people online using it to describe me. So according to good old Google, a centrist is basically someone who has a combination of conservative views and liberal views, pretty much. So a normal person. People who are politically tribal will typically always side with their political team, whereas people who consider themselves to be moderates or centrists or whatever don't really do teams. What I also learned as I was looking more into centrists to try and understand what centrism and what centrists actually were, is that there seems to be a massive misunderstanding about centrists. Centrists often complain that people don't quite understand their political position because it has the word center in it. People assume that if you're a centrist that you have a central opinion on everything. So you try and combine both views all the time. And so sometimes you'll see these really silly memes where it will show a centrist person in the middle, and on one side you have people holding up a sign saying Black Lives Matter, and on the opposite side you have the KKK, because that appears to be the misunderstanding that people have about centrists, is that they just always try to combine two opposing views. But from my understanding, based on listening to centrists, centrism is more so about just simply listening to the different political perspectives that exist and deciding which one you agree with on a case by by case basis. So sometimes you might find yourself agreeing more with the left. Sometimes you might find yourself agreeing more with the right. You're not always constantly trying to find a middle ground, because centrists typically tend to believe that both sides have positive things to offer to society, and it's just a case of deciding which positive parts from each side to take and to apply. And so because of this, centrists don't tend to be drawn into the whole them versus us mentality, because they think that we need both of them. The more I'm talking, the more I'm understanding why people think I'm a centrist. I don't identify as anything, but I'm starting to understand more and more, because in my video where I was talking about why are people leaving the left, I said in that video that I think in order for society to be healthy, you need both the left and the right, and I still firmly stand by that. And so what we've learned today is that a centrist is basically just a normal, level-headed, reasonable person. There are probably plenty of people who would be considered centrists, even though they don't actually consider themselves centrists or call themselves centrists, because the way that the centrist position is described to me it doesn't even sound like necessarily a political group, but more so just like a rational way of thinking. Because when you think about it, that's how you think with everything else, right? So say, for example, you were considering whether or not you wanted to move out of the country. You would probably consider all the pros and the cons of moving out of the country, and then you would make your decision based on which one seems to make the most sense at the time. But for some reason, when you add politics into the mix, some people become very religious. And so if you're on the left, you think that the left is always correct and the left is always good, and the conservatives are evil and the conservatives are dangerous. And if you're on the right, then you think the right is always good and the conservatives are always good, and the left is insane and the left is always bad and the left is going to destroy society. And I just don't think that's like a normal, rational way of viewing politics or viewing the world, because it's way too oversimplistic. But there definitely is a lot of misconceptions about centrists. Centrists are not obliged to criticize both sides equally, because if one side is behaving more unhinged than the other at that particular point in time, it makes more sense as to why they would criticize that side more. Centrists are also not obliged to always try and find a middle ground, because that's not really what centrism really means. I personally think centrist is a terrible name, to be honest. Not that anybody asked, but I think the branding could do with a little bit of work, because I think when you call yourself a centrist, people naturally think that, oh, you're in the center. But really, from my understanding, centrism is not really about being on the center of every issue, but more so about simply making up your mind on each individual issue independently. So just because you might feel more to the left on this issue doesn't mean you're going to now automatically feel more left on that issue too. You're going to decide how you feel about each issue on a case-by-case basis, compared to a leftist who agrees with the leftist position on absolutely everything, and a conservative that agrees with the conservative position on absolutely everything. I think that's really the only difference between these two types of people and the centrist. But going back to the point that I was making about why I think moderates and centrists, or people who kind of land on that part of the political spectrum, are probably most of the people who are politically homeless. Although centrists seem like very logical, rational people, in my personal opinion, you would be quite surprised by just how unpopular they are. It's not uncommon to see videos from progressives or leftists dismissing the concept of centrists altogether, or claiming that moderates and centrists are essentially just undercover conservatives.
Now, what about moderates? What even is a moderate? Well, it depends who you ask and where they live. Typically, it means someone who rejects extreme political views on either side. About 1/3 of Bumble users who display their political affiliations identify as moderate. To some, moderate means I think about it, but I'm underinformed. Or it's a way station for people who grew up in conservative households on their way to becoming more liberal. Though many responded saying that they thought moderates were conservatives in disguise, which would make sense.
And conservatives don't seem to accept them either. A centrist empties himself of any core belief system and adopts the whims of the mob. So it seems that if you are a centrist or a moderate, you have the pleasure of being dismissed as a disingenuous, undercover conservatives by paranoid progressives, or being dismissed as a wishy-washy fence-sitter by the tribal right. It makes sense why many of them would feel as though they don't really have a political home. And for some of them, they may not even have a problem with that, to be honest. They might see both sides and think you're both insane. I want nothing to do with you anyway. I saw a comment recently that perfectly summed up the life of a moderate/centrist. This is a big reason why politics is so polarized today. People are socially punished for taking a nuanced position, and for that reason, few people do. It's much more psychologically rewarding to simply take an extreme position, because then you get 50% love, 50% hate, instead of 90% hate. I do think that this is mostly an online issue though, because as I said before, centrists are just normal people. Like your average, everyday, normal person probably thinks in the way that we would typically associate with being a centrist or centrism, even though they've probably never heard that word before and wouldn't call themselves that. You know, the idea of simply looking at things and making up your mind on a case-by-case basis is how most people who are not ideologues process information and make their decisions. So it may feel as though you are an outlier online, but you are the vast majority of people in the real world. Another reason why I think there probably is an increase in the number of people who feel politically homeless is because definitions around these political terms have become a lot more confusing. Many of these political labels mean different things to different people. For example, I spoke before about how Britain has a slightly different understanding of liberalism compared to the US. And also, interestingly, American conservatives are also quite different to British conservatives. And because all these labels have different definitions and meanings depending on who you are as well as where your location is, I think it has made these labels more confusing, and so has made some people just decide to just stop using them altogether. There are definitely a lot of differences in how we understand these labels and what they mean, and as a result it also affects how we view people and their beliefs. For example, depending on which side of the internet, I am a ton of different things apparently. I've been told that I'm a conservative and in some cases far right by progressive, and I've also been told by conservatives that I have, quote, libtard takes. Americans are definitely a lot more creative with their political insults. Libtard is definitely a new one. Never heard that one before. And as I mentioned before, there are some people on the internet that think I'm a centrist. None of these are labels that I've ever placed on myself or ever declared myself to be. So I do always find it really interesting when people place labels on me and then criticize me for not being enough of the label that they have placed on me. So since people online have placed all of these very contradicting labels on me, I decided to do a political spectrum test to find out where exactly I actually land. Because to be entirely honest with you, it's never something I've ever cared about or particularly thought about, probably because I grew up in a very apolitical household. My parents never spoke about politics growing up, and I never heard them saying what they did and didn't identify as. The political tribalness never really existed in my home, which is probably why I don't have any emotional attachment to any of these political labels in the way that some other people do. And them not being all that interested in politics probably also played a big role in that as well. I remember the last time I tried to have a political conversation with my mum, I was ranting about something I'd seen online or something, and her response to me was literally, "Oh, that doesn't sound very good. Anyway, have you eaten? Are you hungry?" And just like that, the conversation had ended before it had even begun. It is definitely a very Western concept to get your value system from political ideologies. In other parts of the world, that's not really a concept. Like, people have values and they have belief systems, but they don't associate them with left wing and right wing or liberal and conservative. And so I'm not really surprised that my parents never really truly adopted that because they weren't raised in the West. But in regards to my political spectrum test, after searching the internet for one that was actually appropriate for me to do, because the vast majority of them were American, I finally managed to find one that was European, and these were my results. So according to this test, 35.9% of my values are conservative and 64.1% of my values are liberal. So it summarized my values as progressive. However, I managed to be labeled a conservative by progressives, a libtard by American conservatives, a centrist by others, and yet my spectrum test shows that my values are mostly liberal. In my opinion, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I really do think that these terms mean different things to different people and also mean different things depending on which part of the world you're from. I also think it doesn't help that the definitions of these words in many cases has also changed. How the word liberal, for example, is often used today is quite interesting to me because it's often used to describe people who don't actually hold liberal values. In fact, these people don't like liberals. If you saw the way they talk about liberals, because I watch some progressive content creators, and when you look into their comment sections and stuff, you see a lot of very anti-liberal sentiments. So these are some of the screenshots I've taken from some of these more progressive content creators' comment sections. Every liberal is a fascist in disguise. There is no middle ground between fascism and not fascism. This is why liberals and centrists are in fact just useful idiots for fascists. Oh, the liberals, gatekeepers of fascism. It's so interesting to me how to progressives, liberals are the ones who are fascist, despite the fact that liberals have always championed free speech, the freedom of thought and the freedom of ideas, separation from church and state, state, the idea that you have the right to believe in whatever faith you want, but you don't have the right to impose that on others. Meanwhile, progressives are pro-cancel culture, pro-censorship. They believe that you should actually be able to go to prison if you say things that offend someone, or if you say ideas that they don't like. But oh yeah, those liberals, they're definitely the fascists, abso-bloody-lutely. It's almost as if these people don't really know what the word fascism actually means. But as I was saying, despite how progressives and leftists quite clearly do not like liberals, I think it's quite interesting that they're often still referred to as liberals.
All of you, many of you are liberals, or you're refugees, like me. You start to wonder, right? You start to have political identity dysphoria, and you go to conferences like the one I went to in London, and you're like, am I a conservative? Maybe I am a conservative. And then you hang out with conservatives for 3 days, and you go, wow, no, not at all. Not at all. So you realize, we are refugees, and that's okay.
Liberals are also another group of people who I see often declaring that they now feel politically homeless. And I think a large portion of why this is happening is because they don't like what the left has become. As well as the ones who are declaring themselves politically homeless, it seems that some of them are also trying to join conservatives. I spoke about this in my video a while back. I kept seeing all of these videos of people talking about how they were leaving the left and becoming conservatives. As I would listen to them talk and explain their values and their views and why they were leaving the left, I found myself feeling very, very confused because a lot of the stuff that they were saying still sounded very liberal to me. At the time, I tried to make sense of it by concluding that maybe they're just modern conservatives. Maybe they hold these new, more liberalized views, and so they're conservatives, but they're just trying to conserve a different point in history. But now looking back, I think it would be more accurate to describe them as displaced liberals. They're still liberals at their core. If you close your eyes and listen to what they think and what they believe, it very much aligns with the liberal philosophy. But I guess because they don't like what progressives have done to the left, they no longer feel as though they can claim the left anymore, which I personally think is a shame. I don't think that liberals should be giving up their political position or their political post and allowing themselves to be outrun by progressives. I think they should really be standing their ground and fighting for the left, because the left was so much better when liberals were in charge. But what has been interesting to see is that as some liberals move over to the right and start joining the conservative camp and declaring themselves as conservatives, they've actually started to displace some conservatives. There are some conservatives who now feel like the right or these conservative positions no longer represent their values because they've become too liberalized. And recently, some of these conservatives have started to walk away from conservatism altogether and start calling themselves something different, like traditionalists. I saw a video recently of an American explaining why he no longer considers himself to be a conservative, but rather considers himself to be a traditionalist. And many of the criticisms he made about conservatives is stuff that I've also heard being made here in Britain as well, when people are talking about our Tory party, for example, believing that many of those who call themselves conservatives and many of the parties who identify themselves as being conservatives are actually only just conservative in name only, but very much still perpetuate and hold very liberal values. And to them, that's a problem because they think that liberalism is going to cause the demise of society. As more liberals or more liberal-minded people enter the more conservative spaces, it's quite interesting because you'll find that the definition of conservative is even changing. Similar to how the word liberal has kind of changed to describe people who are actually progressives and don't actually hold liberal values, the word conservative has also been changed to accommodate people who are liberal, who don't actually hold traditional conservative values. It's quite interesting now because if you say that a conservative is someone who believes in conserving and maintaining tradition, people will get upset with that. Conservatives are called conservatives because they believe in conserving. They've never really been super pro-change. The conservative philosophy is very much that traditions are important. The way that our society is structured was built this way for a reason, and so it's within our best interest to maintain it. But this is something that has happened as more liberals have started to move over to the right, and they've kind of liberalized the definition of what it means to be a conservative. And in doing so, it seems to me that they are displacing conservatives who don't like this new liberalized way of doing conservatism. The evolution of what it means to be conservative is probably why conservatism seems to be a lot more inclusive these days. It's not uncommon now to see people from all walks of life identifying as conservative. You see openly out and proud gay conservatives, you see trans conservatives, you see pro-choice conservatives, and the list goes on. And And because nowadays the more liberalized understanding of conservatism and the more liberalized perspective of conservatism has become the more mainstream position, I can definitely see why those conservatives who are more traditionalist would also feel quite politically homeless, because there isn't really any political party, at least in many Western countries, that really represents the old school conservative perspective or the old school conservative view. And last but not least, we have gatekeeping. I definitely think that gatekeeping is also another thing that's probably contributing to political homelessness, because along with the definition of these political labels becoming more blurred and confusing and changing depending on who's using them and what part of the world the person is from, there also is this gatekeeping that happens with politics, especially online. Similar to how I mentioned earlier on in my video that you'll often see centrists being told or lectured by other people on what they really are and what they're really not. You also find that people on the left and the right also get told what they really are and what they're really not. So it seems as though even if you pick a tribal team, you can still get kicked out of that team. I think it goes back to what we talked about, how many of these labels have changed over time, and many of these labels mean different things to different people. And so often people, when they tell you that you are this or you're not that politically, they're often just judging you based on their understanding of what that label means. And another thing that I've also noticed is that a lot of people have a very self-centered political gauge when it comes to how they judge people's political positions. So rather than listening to the values that that person has and allocating their political position or guessing what their political position is based on which values they hold and which philosophy seems to be the most in line with what they're saying, often people will say, well, you must be this because I'm that. So if they view themselves as being on the left, then that means you're on the right because you have different views to them. Or if they view themselves as being on the right, then that means that you must be on the left because you have different views to them. An example of this is when Ben Shapiro clashed with Andrew Neil in an interview, and Ben accused Andrew Neil of being on the left, even though Andrew Neil has been open about being conservative.
Why don't you just say that you're on the left? Is this so hard for you? Why can't you just be honest?
Mr.
Seriously,
Shapiro,
it's a serious question.
Mr. Shapiro, if you only knew how ridiculous that statement is, you wouldn't have said it.
So it's very rarely about what you're actually saying and more so about how different what you're saying is to what they're saying. And so there definitely is a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to the political groups, and there's a lot of puritanical mentality among both the left and the right. I've seen people on the right say that you can't be a conservative if you're not religious, and it doesn't make sense to be conservative without being religious. That's something that I've seen happen mostly in America though, because they'd be shocked to discover that a lot of British conservatives aren't very religious. And on the left, there seems to be a lot of conflict between people on the left when it comes to, say, trans issues, for example. Especially here in Britain, we've seen a lot of left-wing feminists being told that they're actually far right. And it's been quite interesting actually to watch a lot of these feminists who still hold very, very left-wing views being told that they're not on the left and that they are far right, etc., because of the fact that they are talking about the conflict of interest when it comes to trans issues. And so I do think for a lot of people who are declaring themselves politically homeless, the gatekeeping that they see within the political sides is just so annoying and they just can't be bothered to deal with it. And so they just decide, you know what, okay, fine, I'm not a conservative, I'm not a liberal, I'm just politically homeless, because they're bored at this point of being lectured about what they really are and what they're really not by the more tribal political types. So I do think it's quite unfortunate and very, very bad for our political democracy if a lot of people don't feel as though the political parties currently in place really represent them. I think this is being shown a lot in many countries where voter turnout rates are very, very low. People feeling disconnected to the political parties on offer is definitely leading to a lot of people feeling very apathetic. They no longer really believe that their vote truly matters, and also having to choose between the lesser of two evils is not really the most ideal way to have to choose a political party to take over your country. So on the voting front and the political parties front, I definitely think that it is a problem that a lot of people feel politically homeless and don't feel like they are represented by the political parties on offer, because I do think it undermines democracy if people don't actually truly have a choice and a say in how their country is being run, because the people on offer to represent them don't truly represent them. But on a personal level, I personally don't think being politically homeless is bad. But like I said, I've never had an emotional attachment to any of these political labels, so I don't really understand the feeling that some people have towards them. For me personally, like I said, you know, I get told I'm a conservative, I get told I'm a libtard. That word is still funny to me, libtard. I get called a centrist. Some people think I'm a libertarian or that I would make a great libertarian. So all the political labels, people just throw them at me at this point, and I care for none of them. And personally, I don't think that labeling yourself is super important. I personally don't think it's all that interesting. I think the ideas that people have is what's interesting, not what label they put themselves under. And I also think that in some cases when people label themselves, it does become like an identity, and so you start going along with whatever your political team tells you you're supposed to go along with. There are so many people who hold views that can't actually tell you why they hold those views. Like if you ask them, okay, that's your view on that, why? They wouldn't be able to answer that. They just know that the friends that they have and the circles that they surround themselves in, these are the kind of things that they often say, and these are the kind of things that they believe. And so they just adopt them because it allows them to be a part of that community. I think for many people, they kind of attach themselves to these labels, not necessarily because they're in search of a philosophy that connects with them the most, and this is the one they stumbled upon, but more so, you know, they just want to have a sense of belonging somewhere. And this just happens to be the one that came about first. But in terms of actually thinking through these ideas and deciding whether or not they actually believe in them, many people really haven't done that, which is why when you ask them, why do you hold those views and why do you believe that? For many people, they really do struggle to answer that question. There are some people who have conviction in their beliefs, regardless of where on the political spectrum they lie. They can tell you exactly why they think it, but there are many who have no idea why they believe what they believe. They just believe it because that's what their team believes. Do you know what I mean? So the team says it, so I believe it. If the team changes their mind tomorrow, I shall change my mind with them. But that is all for this video. I really hope you found it interesting. Do let me know what you think on my theories on why people are becoming politically homeless. I would be very interested to hear your own personal theories on why you think there's a growing trend of people feeling politically homeless in this day and age. If you've enjoyed this video, you may as well like and subscribe. Thank you for giving me your time today, and I will see you in my next video.